Today for our daily Moravian text reading, we are in Romans 15 verse 17 to 29. Paul is writing a little bit about himself, and I think in this section we see something of how God called Paul, something of who God called Paul to, and something of how Paul outworked that calling. So how God calls, who God calls us to, and how we outwork that calling. And so obviously we know that from this passage that Paul was called specifically to the non-Jew, to the Gentile. In fact, he was known as the apostle to the Gentile, the sent one to the Gentiles. We also know from this particular passage that for Paul, there was something about pioneering. God had called him to reach unreached people where the gospel had never been, unreached non-Jews, Gentiles. That's the who. And Paul anticipates in all of his travels and journeys, he's actually going to get as far as Spain. And there was a Jewish community at this time in Spain. In fact, it was known as the end of the known world for Jewish people at this time, as the farthest point of the diaspora, the scattering of the Jewish people. So Paul's ambition is to take the gospel from Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria to the ends of the earth. That's what he's got in mind here. So that's the who. What about the how? How did Paul know that that was his calling? How do we know who God is calling us to? And one of the things we see in chapter 15, throughout chapter 15, is there are a number of Old Testament scriptures that Paul sees his work through the lens of those scriptures. God has highlighted to Paul scriptures. Now, of course, all of scripture is for all of us all the time, something that we generally obey and outwork. But it feels here that these are quite specific to Paul, quite personal to Paul. We might call them kairos words that have clearly resonated with Paul and resonated with who God has made him to be and what God has called him to do. I think that when I read verse 21, those who were not told about him will see, those who have not heard will understand. It feels like a very personal calling for Paul to pioneer in these places amongst the Gentiles. So it's about people and it's about places. It's about, for Paul it was about the Gentiles, and he lists those places, and we know, having gone through Acts, his missionary journeys, of how he wanted to take the gospel from Jerusalem round to Illyricum as far as Spain. That was his plan, and he talks about there's no more place for me to work in these regions. He's got it's like he's mapped it out. He knows the different regions. He's got a plan. He's got intention. Although we know actually he never actually makes it to Spain. He ends up in a Roman prison. So the who, the how he knows that, and the how does he outwork it? How does he outwork that call? Well, very clearly he is focused on the gospel. That is his highest priority, to help people understand the good news of who Jesus is. He's also focused on his testimony. I don't know if you noticed that in verse 18. He says, I will not venture to speak of anything except what Christ has accomplished through me. So he's talking about what God has done in his life and through his life. So he uses his words, but also there's a sense that how does he do it? It's through words and wonders. And when it says here that he has fully proclaimed the gospel of Christ from Jerusalem to Illyricum, which is sort of Croatia, Hungary, that sort of way, fully proclaimed the gospel of Christ. Some people talk about proclaiming the full gospel. They want all the details in it. I do not think that this is what this verse means. It's not about the full gospel, about the content of the gospel. It's about a full proclamation of the gospel. And I would suggest that when we look at the Great Commission, these signs will accompany those who believe. I believe that the proclaiming, fully proclaiming of the gospel is to proclaim it with signs and wonders accompanying it. That's how we fully proclaim it, with words and wonders, a demonstration of the Spirit's power in our witness. So there's words, there's wonders, but there's works here as well. And I don't want us to miss that, because I think works, words and wonders are three really important aspects for all of us to engage in the gospel. Because he's talking about the service of these communities, and really he's talking about financial contributions to the poor. And there's something really powerful about how we love one another in Christian community, how we serve one another in Christian community, how we meet one another's needs in Christian community, that demonstrates through that love that we are his disciples, communities that people want to belong to because they're so attractive, because of how we serve one another in love. Let's fully proclaim the gospel this day.